So I'm Stephanie Plummer. I'm a program coordinator with Nebraska Arts Council. And I want to welcome you to the last session of Winding Down. This one's titled Leaving a Legacy. And prior to this, we had two sessions. One was focused on having discussions and coming to decisions with your board and other important stakeholders about whether to close, go dormant, merge with another organization. And then also the previous session was focused on the legal and financial steps that an organization would need to look at to proceed through that process once they've examined their financial and sort of community impact status. Today's session, Leaving a Legacy, is going to focus on communicating those changes with your community and other stakeholders, thinking about how to preserve that mission in the community, even if your organization has closed or pulled back operations. We're also going to talk about how to preserve that legacy in a more tactile sense in terms of archives, how to preserve that, that information for different purposes in the future. I want to let you know that the topics we're discussing can sometimes be a little sensitive. So prior to this, I sent out an email that gives you instructions on how to change your screen name or remove your camera completely from Zoom view. We are going to record this and make it available later. And so if you are wary about those things, feel free to change your presence in that way anytime. Additionally, Ann Alston from the Arts Council will be fielding direct messages to the questions screen name. So if you do have a question that you feel is a bit sensitive and you'd like to remain anonymous in that, go ahead and direct those questions to her. And then after the presentations, we'll have a Q&A and she'll pass those on to our presenters. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We have two great panelists, Criss Hochstetler and Amy Schindler. So I'll go ahead and introduce them, give you a little bit of background, and then we'll jump into the slide presentation. Criss Hochstetler is the Executive Director of Stuhr Museum in Grand Island, Nebraska. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Legal Studies with a history minor from University of Maryland and a Master's in Public Administration, specializing in nonprofit management. Criss has dedicated the last 30 years to finding leadership approaches that foster organizational gratitude and encouraging teamwork and growing individual and organizational creativity and innovation. Past positions include Dean of Innovation and Creativity at Hastings College, Executive Director of the Coneco in Omaha, Nebraska, Director of Fund Development for the Missionary Society of St. Columban, and Senior Vice President of Resource Development for the American Lung Association. Criss is active in the community and serves on the Board of Trustees for the Greater Grand Island Community Foundation, Prairie Loft Center for Outdoor and Agricultural Learning, Nebraskans for the Arts, the University of Nebraska Medical Center Chancellor's Board of Counselors, and the Hastings Arts Council. He also serves as a youth mentor for the Greater Grand Island Community Foundation Youth Philanthropy Board. And Criss is joining us from the road, so we won't visually see him today, but he is with us. And then I want to introduce Amy. Amy Schindler is an archivist and since 2014 has served as Director of Archives and Special Collections at the University of Nebraska at Omaha Libraries, which includes collections of rare books, university archives, and special collections, such as the Queer Omaha Archives, U.S. Senator Chuck Hagel Archives, Arthur Paul Afghanistan Collection, and regional arts and performing arts collections. Prior to moving to Omaha, Amy was a university archivist at the College of William and Mary in Virginia and curator of manuscripts at the University of Albany SUNY, as well as holding contract positions in local government and corporate archives. She's been actively serving on committees and presenting at conferences for the Society of American Archivists, Midwest Archives Conference, Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference, and other professional organizations. She earned a master's in library and information science and an MA in history with an archives concentration from UW Milwaukee. I love Milwaukee. We'll have to talk about that, Amy. Her BA in history and certificate in Asian American studies is from UW-Madison. So with that, I will go ahead and share the presentation, and we can go ahead and get started on that. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our presenters. I'm really happy that you're all gonna be here with us today. All right. Okay, and we'll just pass it off to Criss then.
Okay, Steph, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, good, and hopefully everybody else can. The first thing I want to say is just thank you so much to everybody for being here and being a part of this series. And exploring what is really the life cycle of humans in this way, because organizations are not just organizations, they are representative of the human beings and the missions that make those organizations up. And so this is very much a human exploration of a life cycle, and that can be very difficult, and it can be also very joyous. And so today, the things that I'm going to discuss are perhaps a little bit more philosophical. Sometimes you may see them as being a little Zen, I suppose. But there's also some technicalities involved that I think we need to discuss. And I'm always welcome to answer questions. I don't know if I even shared my email on the slides, but I'll share it at the end of the presentation. Always available for anybody to reach out and just discuss things. I know this is perhaps a trying time for most all of us, but in some cases a more trying time for some of us. So the first slide that I actually have beyond the title slide, if Steph can cut to it, is something that I'm very fond of, and I want to share a reading to kind of set the tone for where we're at, and that is simply "Nothing Gold Can Stay" by Robert Frost. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. I think it's important for us to reflect a little bit on what this winding down process means. And to me, as I connect it to the very human component of what we do as nonprofit executives, there's nothing that really says it better than Robert Frost's "Nothing Gold Can Stay," because all of our missions are golden. We're personally connected to them. And as Mr. Frost said, those things subside at times, and they carry a lot of things with them, not only grief, but a lot of joy, just like the passing of the seasons. So the next slide that I have is our agenda, and I just want to speak to that agenda a little bit. You'll also note that I took special interest in pulling some of the photographs for this presentation. Some of them I took myself, some of them I found that they were compelling and relevant to the discussion at hand. But a gentle reminder that mission is always our North Star, and just as a nonprofit takes that mission as its core when a nonprofit is standing up and is first being introduced to the public and the world, and is first beginning to exact that change that the founders and the board of trustees or the board of directors want it to do, and that joyful moment when that mission starts to happen, the same has to be true for when we seek to close or wind down our operation. That mission must remain our North Star. So perhaps some little things that you could do to make sure that that happens will be part of our discussion as well. We'll also talk about finding champions, which is a very important part of winding down, making a plan, because nothing good will come of tackling a winding down activity without a plan. And then we'll talk a little bit about grieving as well as celebrating, because both are very important human experiences. And certainly I think that winding down a mission, we need to acknowledge that there's going to be grief and there's going to be also a time to celebrate. And then we'll shift into the documentation of this process. So that's our agenda for the next few minutes. And we'll take a look at mission as our North Star. The first thing that we need to acknowledge, and this needs to be done in a very thoughtful and intentional way, is acknowledging the goodness of that mission, and that hasn't changed. It's merely the circumstances around us that have changed. Now, how do we do that? Well, certainly I think that conversation needs to be done in the boardroom. It also needs to be done with key volunteers. It certainly needs to be done with staff, because there's going to be a lot of questions, and you've got to keep going back to the mission. If that's reading the mission in advance of every single meeting that you do, if that's making sure that it's posted, it's critical that you continue to fall back on that mission, because there's goodness in it, and it will also give you the energy to do what you need to do in the winding down process. Just as that mission guided us in inception, it will be there to guide us in closure. There's no question of that. And oftentimes I think we forget that. Even when nonprofits are just in their day-to-day functions, sometimes they can stray away from the mission and just forget that what they are doing is for the sake of that mission. I think in a winding down process, it's even more so critical that we revisit that mission statement as often as we can. Understanding and planning that the mission is going to continue beyond the longevity of the organization. It just may be through different means or vehicles. It may be even that mission belongs to somebody else. So there needs to be some hard discussions about, okay, is this a mission that we can pass off to another organization? We talked about that in some earlier sessions. That is a critical conversation to have. Just because an organization shutters its doors or winds down does not mean that the mission isn't relevant, and it doesn't mean that that mission can't be carried on by other partners. A good, healthy conversation of what that looks like in the community is vital to not just the health of the mission, but the health of the people who are passionate about this cause. And then finally, being an active participant in preserving and perpetuating the legacy of a mission is critical. You know, there's going to be times, I think, when we kind of want to flee this process. We may lose staff members along the way. You know, we don't know what state the organization is going to be in the winding down process. There may not be funds to pay salaries. There may not be funds to keep an entire staff on board throughout the entire process. And there may be some really hard emotional feelings about that. It's important not only to just exercise human empathy in that, but it's also important to the legacy of that organization's mission in the community, that we don't allow that to become a cancer that just metastasizes throughout the community and creates bad blood. So relying on the mission as our North Star, and then seeking a way to actively participate in preserving and perpetuating the legacy of that mission is important. That could be perhaps even as simple as getting somebody to document the history of the organization for perpetuity's sake or posterity's sake. That could also be playing an active role in shifting that mission to another organization. But it's going to require a vast amount of communication and, as this first slide indicates, a constant reliance on that mission as our North Star. So our next slide, how do we find the people who are going to get this done? It's critical that we find champions. There are certain suspects that are out there for us. I would start with the staff. Most of our staff of a nonprofit are there because of the mission. They are simply not there to get wealthy, and we understand that. We know that. They're not even there necessarily for, in some cases, they're not even there for the paycheck at all. How many times have you ran across an employee who said, yeah, I would do this for free? Well, finding a person on that staff who could exact some of the things that we need to exact in the winding down process is critical. And frankly, they may have to do it for a reduced salary or perhaps no salary at all. And that's a tough road to travel, but they may be there. So having those conversations with that staff is critical. There may be some board members who could champion this, but building a core group of board members who are led by an individual who can take the charge and champion some of this communication in the community is going to be critical to preserving that legacy. You may have some in volunteers. Oftentimes our volunteer community is made up of retirees who are not necessarily looking for dollars, but they are very well equipped, well educated, well known in the community, and passionate about our mission. Perhaps finding somebody in that volunteer corps who could help champion and do some of the work that we need to have happen to wind down appropriately in the community is important. Or else other partners who we may pass that mission off to could help us in this process as well. But identifying a champion early on is important in this process. And it is critical because without that champion, you're not going to be able to convey the message that you need to convey in the community. Frankly, I would also share that quite often it may not be the executive director who sticks around as a champion to see this through. The executive director might be the first person who actually bails, unfortunately, when the doors are looking to be closed. So the next slide is about planning. Planning is simply a must because we cannot communicate what we need to communicate and preserve this legacy without that plan. Messaging is critical. It needs to be based in hope. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be extensive, and it needs to accompany each phase of what we're doing. It starts with the board and the staff and the donors. They need to be communicated a consistent message of why this is happening, how it's happening, and that it is ethical, it's consistent with law, it's also consistent with the mission, and it's consistent with human empathy as we give due consideration to the people who are actually going to be hurt in this process. It also, during this plan, we need to pull together things like press releases. What is the consistent message that we're going to put out there in the press release? What is the social media consistency to that as well? What is the media talking points that you're giving to your board, the community talking points that you're making sure that the board has, so that we negate any speculation in the community of why and how this is happening, how the winding down process is going. If we don't do that, the community will form its own stories, and they will begin to tell those stories, and those stories will be even more damaging than the fact that we do not have the resources to continue delivering the robust mission that we have in the past because of the pandemic, because of, or even if it isn't the pandemic, because of another reason. There needs to be consistency in that messaging, and we need to hit as many of the avenues of communication that we have possible, including putting our champion on radio, on television, in print interviews, on social media, and make sure that that champion has that message down and can convey it with passion and consistency. The mission perpetuation plan also needs to be articulated well, and there can't be any wishy-washiness to it. We have to make that hard call. Is this a handoff? Are we simply reimagining the way that that could be delivered? Or is it a hard break, which it could be a hard break? And that can't be wishy-washy at all. Our next slide deals with a little bit of philosophy here that I want to impart to you as we get ready to shift our direction to my colleague, Amy. And that's simply an acknowledgement that this is really a grieving process. And it's also a celebration process, and we cannot gloss over that. I was speaking to a dear, dear soulmate today, and we were talking about the fact that, you know, the country really hasn't had a chance to grieve or celebrate the loss of life that we've experienced during this COVID pandemic. And in some senses, it's very numbing. It's almost dehumanizing, where we've lost parents, we've lost grandparents, and they've passed away even at the age of an older age of 80 to 90 to even 103. My dear soulmate lost her grandmother at 103 years old. In the last year of her life, she was unable to even hold the hand of her family as she aged in that last year, and then actually as she died. And she did not pass away from COVID. She passed away just simply from old age. But once again, she was a victim of COVID because she didn't get that human empathy, that human interaction in the last year of her life. Our nonprofits who are closing down are no different. Remember the depth of human experience that is wrapped up in each and every single nonprofit. And we have to have an opportunity and acknowledge an opportunity to go through those stages of grief. The first is, of course, denial. Why is this happening? It's not happening to us. We can fight through this. You know, we can make this. It's almost that against all odds, denying that this is going to happen. Then we get angry. Why is this happening? Why didn't the stimulus cover what we needed it to cover? You know, where are the donors at that should be rescuing us? Why? And then a bargaining phase. Well, maybe we could do this or maybe we could do that. And then simply depression and sadness. And finally, acceptance that this is going to happen. All along the way, we will need our champion to be a person or persons who understand this process and understand that we just can't skate through it, that we're going to have to acknowledge each one of these steps along the way. And then finally, one thing that we completely leave out of this process, most typically, and it's been left out of this process with human life as the pandemic has struck us, is simply this celebration of what we've accomplished. There is a time to honor the mission that we have delivered as a nonprofit, to honor the people who have given so much and who have worked so hard to deliver this mission in our community. That needs to be a part of this winding down process. It's one of the greatest ways to concrete a legacy of an organization is to recognize the people who have dedicated their lives to this mission and to honor them very publicly. That's hard to do during this pandemic, but we're on I feel in my heart that we're on the tail end of this thing and that we all have come accustomed to some of the virtual ways that we have of doing some of these things. And it is very appropriate to identify and honor those people who drove that mission for so very long, and then memorializing that. You know, setting aside some funds perhaps to recognize for posterity's sake the organization and once again the people that made it. That could be in the form of a plaque, a monument, a manuscript, something that perpetualizes that for others to reflect back on. And then finally, that celebration. There should be no just parting of ways where the board leaves in tears and there may be some crying. There's goodness in crying, but where the board just goes their separate way, where the staff goes their separate way, where the people who have supported the mission, the stakeholders, the constituents, just go their separate ways without some form of celebration for what we all have accomplished together. If we allow that to happen, we will have divorced ourselves from everything that makes us human. And it's up to us to make sure that that does not happen so that we can memorialize the legacy of this organization and the people that made it up for all time. My final slide shifts into Amy's presentation, which is all of this needs to be documented. It's way too easy to document all of this happening right now. Take notes, take videos, take interviews, and once again, record it for posterity's sake. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I look forward to hearing my colleague Amy continue with it.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Beautiful segue there. I really appreciate it. I also want to express my appreciation to everyone for attending today, and a special thank you to all the folks at Nebraska Arts Council for making this series possible. So today I'm going to talk about two basic things. The basics, what an archives is, so introduce archives to those of you who don't know what it is. I'll talk about the donation process, and then give you some of the very basics for caring for your organization's records if you decide you want to wait a few years before you donate your collection to a repository. So first, what is an archive? So generally speaking, an archive collects, preserves, and provides access to archival and manuscript collections. Okay, Amy, what does that mean? Well, those can be documents, so it might be marketing material, correspondence, board minutes, all that good stuff. Photos, audio-visual recordings, digital files. We do not collect only paper, so just keep that in mind. We want your old diskettes. I've got some up here on top of my cabinet you might see behind me. And then other formats will vary depending upon the collecting repositories, what their limitations might be. So those plaques you might have, that's going to be something that a lot of archives are going to say, that's lovely, no thank you. So just keep that in mind. But other formats that may document your organization's operations as well. So that can be a little flexible with the repository. So then what does an archive actually do once we have these collections? So keep in mind, your collection will not be the only one at a repository. There will be probably many, many other collections, hundreds, if not thousands. What we're usually doing at our repository, and of course this year's been a little different, but we are usually open to the public, and that includes researchers, that includes people who are coming in to look at the exhibitions we're curating in our building. We also do exhibitions in the community spaces and other public spaces. Archives, may host programs. So these could be talks, lectures. In our case, since I'm at a university, we'll have events targeting specific groups of alumni, things like that. And then archives will often also provide instruction sessions for students. And, yes, I'm at a university, but we also see a fair number of high school and middle school students come in, occasionally primary school students as well. That's wild, but it does happen. And then our mission also does include working with the wider public in our, kind of greater Omaha community. So part of that is, the exhibits and the programming, but we'll also do workshops for the public. And those workshops will be on things like caring for your personal archives, which I'll talk about a little later. But it could also be on things like, how do you collect oral history interviews? What is oral history, and other kinds of related topics that sort of touch on archives and the work we do. So archival repositories, we're collecting and preserving this wide variety of material, but a well-managed repository will have a collecting policy that provides some guidelines or limits for what they collect. And just keep in mind, these guidelines will vary by a whole host of factors. It might be a topic, it could be a geographic region, perhaps time period on what they want to collect. As I mentioned before, formats, that's certainly something that's also in our collecting policy, and a lot of archives have that in there. So for example, right now we're currently revising our collecting policy. So it's to be revised, to be determined. But I can share kind of the primary but not the exclusive areas of interest for us. So when we're looking for new collections, our primary focus for us is increasing the representation of historically marginalized communities, here in the greater Omaha area that are in the archives. And topically, we're looking, our main areas are human rights issues. So like our Queer Omaha Archives is part of that human rights interest. We're also collecting in the area of democracy and civics. So that's where the U.S. Senator Chuck Hagel papers fit in. And then in the arts, most of the arts collections we have now relate to performing arts, but we do also have some fine arts material. So the archives that you meet out there in the world, hopefully they should have a similar policy, and that may guide who you end up speaking with about your organization's archives. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Stephanie, thank you. So with the donation process, Chris, talked about the grieving process as you're winding down. And I'll just tell you that, archivists understand that in most cases, we're dealing with folks at difficult times in their life. You know, it might be we're talking with someone who is in hospice and they want to make sure their personal collection gets to an archive before they pass. Or we're talking with children or widows and widowers who are cleaning out the home after someone has passed away. You know, I have gotten more than one call from someone who I would characterize as a community activist, you know, very active in, you know, a specific organization or on a topic like, you know, environmental issues. And for whatever reason, they've sort of reached their wit's end and they have decided to wash their hands of the whole situation. And often in that case, the person is like, I need to talk to you today. I need you, we need to agree on this, because if you don't want it, I'm just throwing it all away because I'm leaving that part of my life behind. So we're used to negotiating some emotionally tricky situations with individuals, as well as organizations that are closing and or have closed down. So I just want to reassure you, an archivist is going to have some sense, hopefully we'll have some sensitivity for that. So, you know, as an archivist, I'm going to admit my bias. I believe that something all of you on the call can do today, maybe in the next month or so, is contact an archive or another cultural heritage repository in your area and begin discussions with them about your archives. Okay. Even if you don't want to donate them right now, just open that conversation to learn more. Okay. And when I talk about archives here, it may be that in your community, you know, you don't have a university that has an official archives department, or your public library doesn't have an official archivist, but your public library may have a local history room, or one of the librarians may specialize in local history and they'd be interested in talking with you about your collection. Or there may be a museum or historical society, you know, obviously in your town or your county that, you know, they're collecting things like the desk from your city's well-known suffragette, but they may also collect archival collections, so your organizational records, okay? So when you send that email or make a phone call to someone about your records, you're gonna wanna have some idea, just a very basic idea about the material you have for potential donation. So, you know, it might be something as simple as telling them, you know, our organization's been around for 40 years, but in the 90s, a pipe burst in our building and all the paper files and all the computers were damaged and destroyed and had to be thrown away. So we've only got like 25 years worth of paper files and then more recent digital files, you know, that we're talking about for part of the donation. Or it might be that, you know, hey, we don't have office space, so all of our files are dispersed. The paper files are dispersed in individual board members' homes, and the digital files are in Google Drive or Dropbox or wherever they may be, okay? So some questions for you to ask the archivist when you're chatting with them. And this might be in your first email, or it might be when you've set up a phone call to talk further after an introductory email. Ask them, what do you collect? So what is their collecting policy? And if they say, oh, we don't have one, that should be a concern to you, because that may be, and Criss knows about this from personal experience, that may be an organization that is just taking in everything without much forethought for how they're going to take care of it long term. And, you know, archivists and museum folks like Criss and I, we all have experience with this. It's very common, especially with newer organizations, but also maybe organizations that haven't had consistent like professional archivists or librarians or curators, whether paid staff or volunteers. So things just get sent there and it's kind of a mess, to be honest with you. So other things to ask. Ask them about how do they care for their collections that they already have. Okay, and they should be able to give you a fairly simple answer to that. You know, you don't need to get into the minutia of it, but do they have an answer for you? Again, if they don't have any kind of answer, that's a flag, okay? Ask them how the public or you as the donor will be able to access the material after you donate it to the archives. Ask them how they would dispose of your collection if someday the archive goes away, or they decide that, you know what, we're changing our collecting policy. No longer going to collect arts material. What are they going to do with them? And then also ask them about what do they require for copyright? Do they require that you transfer copyright to them or not? And that's just something you're going to want to be aware of for later on in sort of your negotiations and conversation. So then another step, next step might be, you know, after folks are vaccinated, or if you want to do this virtually, you know, schedule a tour, visit their repository, see the space, see where people use material, see where your collection will be stored, and then invite the archivist to come over and see your records. Okay, so they can start to get some actual idea of what we're talking about. And let me reassure everybody, you do not need to organize your records before you transfer them to a repository. Don't worry about cleaning things up beforehand. It's fine. We're used to seeing things all in a jumble. So if both parties are in agreement, then you can move ahead with the donation process, and that should include a donation agreement, which might be called a certificate of gift or a deed of gift. Basically, it's the contract between you, the organization, and the repository about what's going to happen with your records. So again, if the repository says to you, oh, we don't require a donation agreement, don't worry about it. You know us, you can trust us. I would urge you to find another repository to continue your conversations with, because again, the folks you are dealing with are unprofessional and they're most likely not following standards and best practices. And I would question their ability to actually care and manage your collection in the midterm, let alone the long term. So these donations are going to vary by repository, but there's some basic pieces you're going to see, you should see in any agreement. And if you ask for one of these pieces and they don't offer it up to you, you might, again, want to walk away. So basically, the document is transferring ownership of the collection from you to the repository, okay? If somebody wants to ask me about the possibility of long-term loans later, feel free. So the repository is going to take on responsibilities for caring for the collection and providing access. That should be in your contract. What the organization then wants to do with copyright, that should be a key part of this arrangement. And that's, you know, some archives will ask you as the organization to turn over copyright. Others will give you the option to retain it for your lifetime or for a set period of time before transferring it to the repository. You know, there's a variety of options there. And, you know, this needs to be decided because copyright for organizations lasts for a long time, 120 years. So it's to the benefit of the archives and you, the organization, and then the potential users and reusers of your collection in the future to make a decision and know what the deal is with the copyright. Because if the copyright is uncertain, that's going to limit some potentially really impactful and meaningful reuses of your collection in the future, okay? So another topic usually covered could be if there are any records that you want to restrict or embargo. So if you decide, hey, board minutes, we're going to limit those. No one can look at those for 20 years. That could be something you put into your agreement. And then there should also be mention in there of what happens if the archive goes out of business, like I said earlier, or decides to stop collecting in your area. Basically, do you want the collection returned to your organization or a specific person? But archives and museums will generally handle this process by, if they can't track down heirs, they will find another home for that material to be transferred to. So, and so let me just say again before we leave this slide, everyone listening, you can contact a local archive to start talking about your potential future donation, where that donation is going to be, you know, in 6 months, or that could be in 6 years or longer. You know, these conversations usually don't just happen really quickly. They usually take months, if not years, okay? And if you know who to talk to in your community, feel free to reach out to me. And even if you're not in, you know, Nebraska, you know, there's a pretty close network of archivists. And so I can probably find someone to put you in touch with who, even if they aren't interested in your collection, they may know someone else who is. So next slide then. So caring for your organization's records. This is something I do like half-day workshops on. So I'm going to cover it in like 2 minutes here, I promise. But this is also something that the workshops are for the public. So if you're interested in maybe doing, you're in the Omaha area and you want to do one in the future, when we're doing in-person workshops again, feel free to email me and I will put you on our mailing list, okay? So on this slide, I really want to emphasize the last couple of bullets here. You know, an important thing is you don't want to damage this material before you turn it over to an archive. So many an archival disaster has been started by a well-meaning employee or volunteer who thought that laminating an organization's like founding documents or photos was the best thing possible to do to preserve that material. And it's actually almost the worst. So leave preservation to the professionals. Don't let anyone bring a laminator into the office. in your closing months, I guess is what I'm saying there. And again, you don't need to wait to contact a repository. Start talking with folks now about your options, okay? You know, and it's perfectly fine to make a donation decision now and, you know, sign the paperwork, and then you can start donating the material in the years to come, okay? You can still put out that press release and make the announcement in your newsletter that you are joining this local archive with your historical records, even if you haven't donated anything as of yet. And then at the end there, I have finally, when in doubt, don't throw it out, which I realize contradicts something we were talking about before this started about how I'm an archivist too in my personal life, and you know, in my work life too. You know, I'm routinely throwing things away and making decisions about what not to keep. But again, you know, there are things that most archives won't want, like we will not want your plaques. We will not want your 5 years of canceled checks or even longer, you know, or bank statements. We're not interested in those for the archives. But in the interest of avoiding the chance of someone with all good intention throwing away, you know, something, oh, just because it's old, you know, they wouldn't want that for the archives. No, that actually may be what we want. Or maybe something fairly recent that, yeah, we do want that. So yes, we want copies of all your press releases, all your newsletters, all the board meeting minutes, reports, you know, annual reports, things like that. But it's sometimes hard to, you know, catch every single type of record. So that's why we do tell people, when in doubt, please don't throw those things away. So again, if you're in Omaha, feel free to contact me about future workshops. But also if your archives, or if your organization wants to hire an archives consultant to help you get your records under control, I can try to offer some referrals for you. I will also do basic consultations as part of my community service work for my job. I'm not on probation. Just to be clear about that. So, and that would be just like maybe an hour-long phone call or video call, or, you know, in the future, years from now, maybe some visits to kind of offer you some basic guidance with your particular situation, the records you have. And I may have to decline, but I'm never offended when someone asks me if I'm willing to offer some advice or some referrals. So please feel free to do so. And thank you. Yeah, there's my contact info.
Thank you so much, Amy and Chris. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now, and we will move into questions. I don't know if there are any in the chat. I'm not seeing any. So we will ask Anne if she received any questions.
Hi, Stephanie. Yeah, a few. Here's an interesting question that probably goes back to what Chris was talking about at the beginning. How do you overcome negative sentiment in the community with invested donors and partners? And I know he touched on that, but that's the question that came in.
Hey, Anne, thank you. Yes, it's something that we're all going to have to face, because you have to put yourself in the shoes of those donors and those investors, those constituents who are going to feel like they have been, regardless of the reason why we're shuttering or we're winding down, they're going to feel like they've been slighted, that their investment wasn't appreciated, that perhaps even it was a waste. And I think that individual meetings with those people or individual conversations are really important. And I realize that could be really hard and difficult to do in this winding down phase, because you're going to have limited staff, you'll have limited resources and ability to do that. But it's vital that we meet with those people and that we discuss and we talk and we honor their contributions and their gifts to the organization, and then try to help redirect their activity as well, especially if the mission is a handoff to another nonprofit organization or another organization of perhaps another type, that we do a handoff of that particular donor's interests anyway, not their history or anything like that, but their intentions. You know, you can make a simple introduction, for example, if they are wanting to continue work with that particular mission. And it's vital that we do that, else we are going to get that negativity that's just going to like a cancer metastasized to the community, and then once that narrative is out there, there's no way to pull it back.
Oh.
And if I could just add something, I've had experiences with organizations that have closed where they've had really engaged volunteers, and the kind of folks who are like, I don't know what I'm going to do if I can't come here every week, right? And so some of those volunteers have transferred to the archives for short-term or long-term to help organize the historical records, because they have a great memory of, they can look at photos and say, oh, that's our annual event we did in the 90s, and help with that kind of thing. So just another idea.
That's a really practical suggestion. There is another question that's, I think it follows the first one, similar in a way. And that has to do with, you were talking earlier, Criss, about finding champions. And the question is, what if you just can't find that champion to see the organization through the winding down process?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one, because we really do need somebody or a group of somebodies who could carry us through this process, realizing that there may be some nonprofits, particularly in our smaller communities, where we just don't have a base to pull from. So what I would suggest is that we first try to exhaust every means possible to find somebody who was connected with the organization and make a champion out of them. We may have to spend some time with them to actually develop a champion, and that's something that we didn't talk about a whole lot. But you may want to go through your past volunteer archives and find some of those folks who maybe volunteered long ago but had fallen away from the organization for some reason, and you may have to go out and meet with these people one-on-one to try to uncover somebody that maybe is not a current board member or current staff member or current volunteer, but that would be willing to sit down with you and actually become a champion, even though they may be somewhat unfamiliar with the organization in its current state.
Thank you. Here's another question. I think this is more for Stephanie. How would communications for an organization that is going dormant be different from one closing down permanently?
I think that one's for Criss.
Oh.
So I was just wondering, Criss, what your perspective on communications for an organization going dormant, how would that be different, do you think, or how would you approach that differently than one that's closing down permanently?
Oh, that's a great question, Steph. Stephanie and I have, I think, a little bit of almost relatability to this, not fully, but when you're in an organization and things start to wind down a little bit, not necessarily to closure, but to dormancy, it is very, very, very important that there is consistency and positivity in that message. Not quite as different, I guess, as what we talked about earlier, save for the fact that the message that you're sharing is that we're not going away. We're just going to pull back a little bit. We're going to sleep a little bit. Things are going to change, probably change for the better. Always tilt towards the positive, and make sure that you've got that consistency and that everybody understands that consistency. It's very difficult when people are so connected to the mission to fall into even an organization that is just going dormant, where they can fall into that grief and just kind of take on an "oh, woe is me," and that really will develop a lot of discontent, I think, in an organization, and it will spiral. And we do have a little bit of personal experience with that, I think, happening, and you have to be very careful of that, because change, for the most part, is good. And even a dormancy is a type of change, if you can think of like a chrysalis almost. And then what emerges from the chrysalis is quite oftentimes much more beautiful than what went into the chrysalis. And I feel like the message needs to contain some of that philosophical intention.
Thanks, Criss. That's a great answer.
Here is an archival question. Will the archives digitize all of the analog records that we turn over to them and then share those records online? And if so, quickly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a conversation you should have with the repository where you're going to donate your material. You know, if that is something you would like to see happen in the, you know, near term, what are the repository's capabilities to do that? Now, the archives, like I will say to folks, well, you know, we prioritize collections based on a number of factors, including, you know, what is the research demand for the collection? Does the collection represent, you know, marginalized individuals or organizations? So there's, you know, an interest there. And, you know, we will also ask donors when they're making a gift, whether it's an individual organization, will you be making a financial contribution to support this collection you're donating? We don't require people to make that gift, but sometimes when folks make that gift, they say, and we'd like this to go towards helping to digitize some or all of the collection. So digitization is a very expensive process because you know, people are like, oh, I can just scan these things at home. Yes, you can scan something very quickly, but then actually creating the description so that it's searchable and findable online, as well as preserved for the long term and doesn't just go away in a few years, does take a lot of staff or volunteer time at the repository. So that will be a negotiation, a conversation to have with the repository so that your expectations are not like, oh, they're going to scan this, you know, within a year of us donating it. So yeah, conversation.
Thank you. Here's another archival related question. And this might be particularly of interest to smaller and more rural communities. What do I do if there is no archive or archival resource in my town, or if the public library with a local history room doesn't want my organization's records?
Yeah, so that would be an instance where I'd encourage you to reach out to myself, you know, or if you're here in Nebraska, another of my colleagues at one of the other, you know, University of Nebraska campuses, and we can offer some suggestions, whether or not, you know, we might be that option. And for those of you obviously calling in from other places, you know, I would go to what's your nearest reasonably sized state university and talk to the archivist there, and they may have some suggestions for you. Like I said before, it's a pretty small world for cultural heritage folks, and we all sort of end up knowing each other and knowing somebody else who knows someone else. So we can help you identify where another option might be for you to donate your collection.
I would add too, I think, in my light archiving experience, some towns too will have like a local newspaper that's actually functions as an archive repository too. So yeah, I mean, you know, not in a bad, not saying that like they're doing it in a bad way, but just, you know, they may have the staff and they may have trained archivists because they may want to, you know, they might be archiving their own records. Amy, you're disagreeing with me. So
I would say with the, you know, what I know about the newspaper industry, I would say, again, long-term, that's not a real solution.
That's true. That's a good point.
In having your material because they want to mine your photos for like this day in history or future stories. But, you know, when that newspaper goes away, they're under no obligation to maintain your archive. So
that's a great point. So thank you for correcting my
I like the outreach
past
idea.
Experience, though. So I mean, I think that raises a good point, though, is that you might be aware of people saving things, but that doesn't necessarily make them an archive. So I appreciate the correction.
I would, however, share that in many cases, the community may actually have a museum, or there may be a museum in the state that would be interested in the work that the nonprofit did as it related to state history. And those conversations, there are a lot of executives out there, museum executives, who are willing to have those conversations because we are in the business of recording and preserving that history. And, you know, it's not a stretch to say that you could have that conversation with a museum executive and then turn those documents over to a museum archive if it may have certain relevance.
And I have one thought too, and one question that might be a nice question to end on is, what are maybe some examples of ways to celebrate an organization after it has wound down? If there are any examples, maybe Criss or Amy, that you've seen in your experience, or if anybody has any suggestions that they've seen that they want to add to the chat, that would be nice too.
I feel like there could be a lot of attention given to a community type event. You know, your donors, the people who used to come to your events, you know, the folks that are volunteers, maybe a potluck or something like that. You know, if we can get post-COVID where we can actually gather, I could see something like that having a lot of relevance. I know that in organizations that I have seen that not necessarily wound down, but kind of dispersed, if you will, or kind of went their separate ways. Some of the best moments were when you could get those people who made that organization up and delivered that mission, when you could get them all together and just reflect and maybe enjoy some good food that everybody brings, you know, their own particular dish. We have a tendency to like to celebrate over food, and it's also comforting, I think, when we can sit down and eat with each other and have good conversations of remembering things like, well, do you remember when that happened, or remember when this happened, or when so-and-so did that, you know, remember this board meeting when this happened and so-and-so fell asleep, right? Those are all important things to reflect on and to find joy in what you did and what you accomplished together. So I think any type of event where you can pull people together who were involved with the organization is a good idea, even if it's a simple Zoom where everybody raises a glass of wine and toasts the good work that everybody did.
That's lovely. I'll just remind everybody of something Criss said earlier in his remarks too. He mentioned like oral history interviews, or you know, doing a story circle and recording that, which could then, you know, go into your local archive or library or museum. And that could also be part of your conversation when you're talking to the archives about your donation is, hey, do you have an oral history program here that would, you know, be willing to collect interviews from some of our, you know, longtime employees or board members, you know, and again, the repository may say, we can do that if you can make a donation, but it's worth asking. But also, you know, doing displays and exhibits at your local public library and those kinds of things are a great way to use that historical material, and integrate people's memories into those too.
All right. So I want to thank our presenters, Criss and Amy, especially for being with us today and imparting so much wisdom. And I want to let you know I'll be sending out a survey about our series and would love to hear your feedback. Any questions you have, you can pop that into the survey, or feel free to email myself and I will pass that along to our panelists throughout the series. So thank you, everyone.